Just imagine for a moment. It's 1946. You've been given a task that sounds almost impossible. Write a single rule book for over 300 million people. A people who are part of a nation that's home to nearly every major religion on Earth, that speaks hundreds and hundreds of different languages, and is just about to wake up from 2 long centuries of colonial rule. This task, it's not just about writing laws. It's about forging a brand new identity from incredible diversity. This, right here, is the amazing story of how India created its constitution.
So that's the central question, isn't it? How do you even begin to write the rule book for what would become the world's largest democracy? The sheer scale of that challenge is just mind-boggling. We're talking about a nation on the very brink of 2 massive events happening at the same time: independence and partition. It needed a single, powerful document to unite it, to guarantee rights to every single person, and to lay the foundation for a democratic future. Well, this is the story of how they pulled it off.
Okay, first things first, let's get one thing straight. The Constituent Assembly, that's the body that actually wrote the Constitution, it wasn't some kind of generous gift from the British. Not at all. It was the result of a long, hard-fought struggle by Indians who were demanding the fundamental right to decide their own future on their own terms.
So how did this idea even come about? Well, it didn't happen overnight. If you look at this timeline, you can see how the momentum built up over years. It really started back in 1934 as a pretty radical idea from a communist pioneer, M.N. Roy. By 1938, it wasn't a fringe idea anymore. It had become the official demand of the Indian National Congress, with Jawaharlal Nehru making the case. The British? Well, they were slow to come around. In 1940, they sort of agreed to it in principle, with something called the August Offer. But it took a world war to really push things forward. And finally, in 1946, they sent the cabinet mission to India to actually lay out a real workable plan. This whole process shows you it was a steady, relentless push for self-rule.
So, the plan is finally in place. The demand has been met. Now comes the monumental task of actually putting together the group of people who would take on this historic responsibility. This body, as we mentioned, was called the Constituent Assembly. The Assembly was originally set to have 389 members. And this chart really shows you the complicated political map of India at the time. You essentially had 2 Indias. First, there was British India, which got 296 seats. These were the provinces that were directly ruled by the British. But then you had the princely states, which were given 93 seats. These were over 500 semi-independent territories, each with its own local monarch or ruler who had a treaty with the British. Bringing these 2 very different parts of India together was one of the first major challenges. And just look at this breakdown. It gives you an incredible snapshot of India's sheer diversity. Now, was it a perfectly proportional representation of every single group? No. But there was a very real effort to make sure that the room was filled with voices from all of India's major communities. You had Hindus, Muslims, scheduled castes, Sikhs, Indian Christians, and so many others. The goal was that everyone should have a seat at the table while the future of the nation was being decided.
So you might be wondering, how were all these people chosen? This is a really crucial point. It wasn't through a direct election where every adult in India voted. That was just not practical at the time. There were no proper electoral rolls, and the logistics would have been impossible. So they came up with a compromise. The members from British India were elected indirectly by the members of their own provincial assemblies. And for the princely states, well, their representatives weren't elected at all. They were simply nominated by the rulers of those states. It was a practical solution to get this huge undertaking off the ground.
Picture the scene. It's December 9th, 1946, the first ever meeting of the Constituent Assembly, a historic day. But there was a massive shadow hanging over the proceedings. The Muslim League, which had won a significant number of seats, decided to boycott the meeting completely. They were absolutely firm in their demand for a separate nation, Pakistan. This meant that the assembly started its work with this painful, looming reality of partition hanging over every single discussion.
But even with all that political turmoil and the uncertainty of partition, the members who did show up knew they had a job to do. They got right down to business. And before they could even think about writing laws, they had to answer a much bigger question. What is our fundamental philosophy? What is going to be the very soul of this new constitution? Just 4 days after that first meeting on December 13th, Jawaharlal Nehru stood up and presented this landmark document, the Objectives Resolution. You can think of it as the mission statement for the new India. It was the blueprint, the moral compass, the guiding star that would shape every debate and every article that came after it. Just listen to the power of those opening words. Nehru declared the Assembly's firm and solemn resolve to proclaim India as an independent sovereign republic.
This was so much more than just a political phrase. It was a powerful declaration of freedom, a clean and decisive break from a colonial past. It was India saying to the world, we are our own masters now.
The resolution then laid out the core values of this new republic. It promised a united India. It made it clear that all power comes from the people, not from a king or a foreign government. It guaranteed justice, social, economic, and political. It promised equality and freedom to all citizens. And, very importantly, it specifically included safeguards for minorities, for tribal areas, and for other disadvantaged groups, directly acknowledging the deep inequalities that existed in Indian society. These weren't just legal ideas, they were profound moral promises.
And here's the reason this resolution is so incredibly important, even today. After it was adopted unanimously by the Assembly, the spirit and a lot of the actual wording of this objectives resolution were refined and became the preamble to the Constitution of India. That vision that was laid out in 1946 is the very same promise that introduces the Constitution to every Indian citizen today.
Okay, so having a grand vision is one thing. It's inspiring. But turning that vision into one of the most detailed and complex legal documents in the entire world, that is a whole different ballgame. This is where the really meticulous, painstaking process of drafting began.
Now, there were many different committees working on various parts of the Constitution, but the most crucial one, the one that had the final say on the wording and structure, was the Drafting Committee. And at its head, as chairman, was the brilliant legal scholar Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. His intellectual leadership and his masterful guidance through the complex debates are why he is quite rightly hailed as the father of the Constitution of India.
And let me tell you, this process was anything but rushed. It was incredibly thorough and democratic. First, different committees would create reports on specific topics. Then, Dr. Ambedkar's team took all those ideas and wove them into a first draft. But they didn't just vote on it. They published it and gave it to the people of India for 8 months to read, to discuss, and to criticize. After that, it went back to the Assembly for marathon sessions. They went through the draft line by line, clause by clause. Just think about these numbers. Over 7,600 amendments were proposed, and they debated nearly 2,500 of them in full detail. That is an unbelievable level of scrutiny.
So, how long did this whole thing take? From the first meeting to the final adoption, the final count is 2 years, 11 months, and 18 days. That's nearly 3 solid years of relentless debate, drafting, arguing, and refining to create the final document.
And what about the cost? The total expenditure came to 64 lakh rupees. Now that might not sound like a lot today, but in the 1940s that was an enormous sum of money. It just shows you how seriously everyone took this incredible national project. And then, finally, the day came. On November 26, 1949, the work was finished. The final motion was passed, and the Constitution of India was officially adopted by the Assembly. And to honor that historic moment, India now celebrates this day every year as Constitution Day, or Samvidhan Divas.
Of course, it's easy to look back with rose-tinted glasses and see this as a perfect process that created a perfect document. But that's not the whole story. To really understand the Constitution, we have to look at its legacy, and that includes the very real and often valid criticisms that both the Assembly and the document have faced over the years. So, let's get into it. Okay, so let's break down the main debates. The first big critique is that the Assembly wasn't truly representative, because remember, it was indirectly elected. The counterargument, though, is that even without direct elections, great care was taken to ensure all sections of society were represented in the final body. Another common point is that it was totally dominated by the Congress Party. But as the famous historian Granville Austin put it, at that unique moment in time, the Assembly was the Congress and the Congress was India, meaning the party itself contained a huge range of different opinions. Some say it took way too long, nearly 3 years. The defense is that the framers were studying about 60 other constitutions from around the world, trying to pick the best ideas for India's incredibly complex situation. Finally, people point out it was dominated by lawyers, and that's true, which is why the document is so legally precise, but it's also why it can be so complex and difficult for a layperson to understand.
And beyond all the high-level debates, there are these amazing little details that just bring the whole process to life. For instance, the official seal of the Assembly was the elephant, chosen to represent the size and strength of the new nation. The key constitutional advisor, the man behind the scenes, was the brilliant jurist Sir B.N. Rao. And the chief draftsman, who handled the nitty-gritty legal language, was S.N. Mukherjee. And maybe my favorite fact of all, the original Constitution wasn't printed on a machine.
It was handwritten, beautifully, in a flowing italic script by a calligrapher named Prem Bihari Narain Raizada, an incredible work of art. And that brings us to our final thought, a question for you to reflect on. The framers made a conscious choice. To deal with India's immense diversity and its unique problems, they created one of the longest, most detailed, most exhaustive constitutions in the world. But here's the question. Did that incredible level of detail become its greatest strength, providing clear guidance for almost any situation? Or did it become its biggest challenge, creating a document so complex and rigid that it's hard for the average person to connect with? That's a debate that continues.